on a Sunday evening to discuss about the famous judgment of Ram Janam Bhoomi. And as we all know that though famously it is known as Ram Janam Bhoomi's case, but otherwise it is M. Sadiq dead through LRs versus Mahant, Suresh Das and others. And since it was a matter arising out of the first appeal and the way forward as to what is the way to look upon the issues as a lawyer or a student of law, and even otherwise who was interested to understand the nitty-gritties within the understandings as to how the first appeal could be decided. What is the manner of appreciation of the evidence in a first appeal? Since we are talking the first appeal with reference of the famous Ram Janam Bhoomi's case, there would be large number of issues which Honorable Mr. Justice A.V. Chandrasekhar, and well-known erudite speaker, would take us to the various aspects which have been discussed in this voluminous judgment. And it is one of the rare judgments where the constitutional bench, every judge has concurred. And since there are various aspects to be considered and discussed, that is regarding adverse possession, regarding the Limitation Act, regarding the various issues, I had the privilege to be read the article written by Justice Chandrasekhar as to what is the scope of expert evidence and its acceptabilities, Waqf by lost grant by a public user, effect of interim orders of attachment on title suits. And at the outset, we would say that normally the webinar is over by 1.5 hours, but slightly this insights itself will be taking around 1.5 hours. And thereafter, we will be taking questions, but keeping in view the constraint of the time, we will take the first question first, but that does not mean at the outset that you start posting the questions for your knowledge insights. It would be appreciated that the questions are posted around 6:25 so that we can take the questions accordingly. And no religious overtones be reflected in the questions because this judgment is being discussed purely and purely on the basis of an academic exercise to understand as to how the first appeal on the civil side under section 96 of the Civil Procedure Code could be understood. And those who have been connected with us, that is on the platform of Beyond Law CLC, know that Mr. Justice Chandrasekhar had given us the insights on the topic of art of cross-examination. That is a tremendous hit, not only on the YouTube, but also on the Facebook and other social medias. Keeping in view, we felt that the judgment, which is quite close to the sentiments of all citizens of India, we should have an insights from a speaker who can take us to that momentous judgment to understand the entire subjects in greater details. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invite and to share these insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vikas. Pleasant good evening to all and the organizers. I'm very delighted to be amongst the community of lawyers who appear before the court day in and day out, conducting civil and criminal cases. Lawyers who mostly practice in trial courts need to know the nitty-gritties of a trial in a criminal case as well as recording of evidence in a civil case. Well-laid procedures are found in Criminal Procedure Code and Civil Procedure Code. A lot of speakers have already spoken about the various aspects of Criminal Procedure Code and few aspects of Civil Procedure Code also. And few erudite speakers have also spoken about certain important provisions of substantive law which will be pressed into service on a day-to-day basis before the trial courts. Friends, I was a judge of the trial court. I was a district judge who was expected to record evidence, and I had the opportunity of recording evidence for a continuous period of 4 years as an additional city civil judge at Bangalore, a place where very eminent lawyers used to appear. Afterwards, I had to record evidence mostly in sessions cases. Be as it may, a lawyer who appears in the trial court should know all the nitty-gritties of examination in chief, cross-examination, re-examination, and the important provisions dealing with them in the Indian Evidence Act. Friends, as rightly pointed out by Mr. Vikas, let us not be swayed away by the final outcome of the Constitution bench in the case of Siddiq LRs versus Mahant Suresh Das and others. It is true that as lawyers, as law practitioners and judges, we are more concerned with the obedience to law and the constitutional regime that we have after the Constitution was accepted by us on 26/11/1949. All of you know very well, Section 96 of Civil Procedure Code deals with the regular first appeals. Whoever loses either in part or in its entirety a suit in the trial court will have a vested right in terms of Section 96 of CPC to file an appeal before the appellate court. This aspect of the matter with regard to the vested right of a person who is aggrieved by a judgment in the trial court is well recognized by a Constitution bench decision rendered in the case of Garikapati versus Subbaiah Chowdhury, AIR 1957, Supreme Court, page 470. It's a wonderful judgment, decision of the Constitution bench, authored by Justice S.R. Das. I request all the youngsters to read this judgment without fail. This judgment also not only speaks about the vested right of a person who has lost in the trial court either in part or in entirety, but also speaks about the effect of amendments pending a suit or an appeal. The normal rule is amendments are prospective. Amendments can be retrospective if the amendment itself speaks to that effect or by necessary implication. Then how to deal with a first appeal is eloquently dealt by another decision of the Supreme Court, a decision rendered by a bench consisting of 3 honorable judges. Sri Justice R.C. Lahoti, in his inimitable style, has eloquently explained the power of the first appellate court with regard to the appeals. The said decision, may I request all of you to make a note who have not come across this decision, may I request all of you to deeply study this decision. AIR 2001 SC 965, equivalent to 2001 third volume SCC 179, Santosh Hazari versus Purushottam Lal Tiwari. In paragraph 15 of the said decision, Honorable Justice Lahoti has very succinctly laid down, reiterated the approach to be adopted by the first appellate court. Whenever the first appellate court intends to dismiss the appeal by confirming the judgment of the trial court, it need not write a detailed judgment reiterating all the points, and it would be sufficient. It would discuss the evidence to the peripherally and expressing its opinion. In case the first appellate court intends to overturn a judgment of the trial court, it has to come to close quarters, its own close quarters, and assign its own reasons as to where the trial court has gone wrong and what should have been the proper approach. This is virtually the entire law with regard to the scope of the first appeal has been eloquently dealt with. All of you know very well, first appellate court is an appeal under section 96 of CPC read with order 41 of CPC is the final court of facts. No appreciation will be done normally under section 100 of CPC when a second appeal is filed. All of you know very well that a second appeal under section 100 of CPC is maintainable only if substantial questions of law arise for consideration. The advocate appearing for the appellant in a second appeal will formulate substantial questions of law. The appellate court may concur with such substantial questions of law as substantial questions of law. And even if the first appellate court judge were to not concur with the proposed substantial questions of law, it has a duty to look into as to whether any other substantial question of law arises for consideration. All of you know very well that a second appeal will be admitted only if substantial questions of law arise, and they must be formulated at the time of admission, and then only the matter will be taken up. And it is not in the province of the second appellate court normally to reappreciate evidence. In exceptional cases, evidence may be reappreciated. Therefore, friends, may I request all the young lawyers who draft pleadings to appear before first appellate courts also. First appellate court has all the trappings of a trial court. It can record evidence. If an application is filed under Order 41, Rule 27 of CPC. Of course, recording of evidence or sending the matter for the limited purpose of to the trial court for the limited purpose of recording evidence as indicated is an exceptional one. If for any reason the court were to favor the appellant's view to record evidence, it may either record or may send it to the trial court for the limited purpose of recording evidence. And if findings are to be given on a particular aspect, then an opportunity will have to be given in the appellate court about the findings of the trial court, and then the first appellate court has to move in terms of Rule 25 and 26 of Order 41 of CPC. One important provision found in Civil Procedure Code is Order 41, Rule 31 of CPC. What points are to be framed by the first appellate court? Anyhow, for a second appeal to be filed, now will propose substantial questions of law, but they are not expected to propose the points to be considered by first appellate court, and it is in the exclusive domain first appellate court itself to formulate appropriate points for consideration. The grievance of many advocates insofar as the points that would be normally or in few cases would be formulated by the first appellate court will be as follows: whether the judgment and decree of the trial court is perverse, capricious, and therefore requires interference, and if so, to what extent interference is called for. Honorable Supreme Court and various high courts have categorically held that points must be formulated by the first appellate court in accordance with the mandate of Order 41, Rule 31 of CPC. What is the basis for formulating such points for consideration in the first appeal? Those points must be framed on the basis of the tenable grounds raised in the appeal memo and the grounds that are permitted to be urged. Because some points might have been left out while filing the appeal. During the course of advancing arguments on merits or prior to that, an application may be filed to raise some more points. After hearing both the sides, the court feels that these points are tenable, then they become part of the points. Therefore, the advocate appearing for an appellant in the appellate court and also advocates appearing for the respondents must be cautious while dealing with these grounds, tenable grounds in the appeal. Yeah, friends, normally when an application is filed in the trial court in a suit, any interlocutory application, it will be considered the moment it is filed. If an application under Order 6, Rule 17 is filed in the trial court, an opportunity will be given to the other side to file its objections, and thereafter, hearing the arguments on that application, necessary decision will be taken, either by allowing the application or rejecting it, as the case may be. Similar is the case with an application under Order 26, Rule 9 of CPC, in which a commissioner's appointment is sought, or an application filed under Order 1, Rule 10 of CPC to add a necessary party or a proper party. But when such applications are filed before an appellate court, an opportunity has to be given to the other side to file objections, if any, and to put forth its cause. But such applications must be considered along with the merits, arguments and merits. Such applications must not be considered independently, is the law laid down by the Honorable Supreme Court long back, and reiterated in 2011 in the Malayalam Transplantation versus State of Kerala. If ultimately, after hearing the arguments and merits, as well as on the interlocutory application filed either under Order 6, Rule 17 or under Order 26, Rule 9 or under Order 1, Rule 10, and ultimately if the court feels that such application is to be allowed, the pronouncement of judgment will be deferred and further arguments will be heard, and that application will be considered. And in case the court comes to the conclusion that appointment of a commissioner is not required, or a proposed amendment is not required, or IA filed under Order 1, Rule 10 of CPC is not required, it will have to dismiss the application and pronounce the judgments on merits. All of you know very well, Order 41, Rule 22 provides a party, the respondent, to file an appeal in the form of cross objections. Order 41, Rule 33 of CPC is a wonderful provision found in the Civil Procedure Code. Even in spite of some negative finding, can support the judgment, and not only support the judgment, and if the appellate court feels that some statutory obligation, some statutory reliefs which ought to have been given is not given, not with still or a cross objection being not filed, the appellate court has still the power to grant such reliefs. Let us assume that in a suit for partition, a person against whom a decree is passed, he has filed an appeal. And the respondent in whose favor the decree is passed, and he has not filed any cross objections or any appeal insofar as the inadequacy of share. Let us assume that the respondent should have been granted 1/4 share. Only 1/5 share is granted. And he doesn't file an appeal or cross objection. But still, if the court feels that according to the statute governing the personal law of the parties, he was entitled for 1/4 share, notwithstanding an appeal being not filed or a cross objection being not filed, the appellate court is bound to grant the relief. And such provisions and such wonderful provisions are found in Order 41 of CPC. Friends, I am giving only few important overview of few important provisions of Order 41 of CPC. Section 96 is the substantive provision, and Order 41 is the application part of the same. First appellate court has all the trappings of a civil court. First appellate court has all the powers which the trial court has. It can allow the appeal, set aside the judgment. It can allow the appeal partially and modify the judgment. It can remand the matter if provisions of Order 41, Rule 23 or 23A are comply or do fit in. It can vary the judgment or modify the judgment. Same are the powers with the first appellate court in a criminal appeal also. My endeavor to focus the point is that if an advocate do not effectively conduct the first appeal, the doors are closed. Normally, when judgments are concurrent, when the judgment of the trial court is upheld by the first appellate court, normally the second appellate court will not interfere, because findings given on facts are not to be disturbed in a second appeal. That is the law laid down and reiterated in various judgments of the Supreme Court. It is not as though all concurrent judgments are not fit to be taken up in a second appeal. Of course, if material evidence is ignored or evidence which ought to have been considered is not properly read or misread, there is misapplication of law to the facts of the case, then only the second appellate court, in spite of concurrent judgments, will interfere. The advocate appearing for the first appellant, especially the respondent, the appellate as well as the respondent, in case the first appellate court intends to overturn the judgment of the trial court, it has to give very clear reasons as to where the trial court has gone wrong and as to what should have been the proper approach. This is very important. Therefore, in second appeals, normally in second appeals, where divergent judgments are found, the judges, to a great extent, will go deep into it and find out whether any injustice is done by the first appellate court while upturning a judgment of the trial court. It is not as though the first appellate court cannot upturn a judgment of the trial court at all. It has got all the powers. First appellate court has got all the powers, and it can set aside the judgment of the trial court in its entirety. And even then, second appeal may not be admitted. But normally, judges with their great experience will be slow in dismissing the second appeal at the threshold. They will try to find out as to whether there are any real substantial questions of law arise for consideration. Friends, I tell you, to me, appeals, whether civil or criminal, were very close to my heart. Even as a district judge, I used to withdraw many cases from the courts of civil judge senior division and dispose of. And in the High Court also, I had the great opportunity of the assistance of wonderful advocates wherever I work, whether in the principal bench or the other benches at Dharwad or Kalburgi. My focus is to see that the length of the litigation gets shortened. Suppose a suit takes about 7-8 years, and first appeal takes 5 years, and second appeal takes another 7-8 years. So the length of the total litigation would be about 20-25 years. And if for any reason Article 136 of the Constitution were to be invoked and special leave were to be granted, we do not know. It may take also another 5-6 years in the Supreme Court because of the pendency of cases. It is in this view of the matter, the advocates appearing for the trial court as well as the First Appellate Court must be very cautious. I request all of you to cautiously prepare the pleadings. Pleadings are the foundation in a civil case. You can't lead evidence, divorce the pleadings. Whatever is pleaded alone can be proved. There cannot be any difference between the pleading and proof. This is the first principle in a civil case. First principle in a civil case must be borne in mind. With this background, may I go to the nitty-gritties, important nitty-gritties of this great judgment, wonderful judgment of the Supreme Court, decision of the Supreme Court in Siddique, dead by LRs versus Mahant Suresh Das. It was decided on 9/11/2009, historic day in the history, in the judicial history of our country. As rightly pointed out by Mr. Vikas, let us not go by what the outcome of the decision. Of course, the two parties that were strongly advocating were Muslims on the one side and Hindus on the other side, because the whole judgment speaks in that regard. But the judgment is classic for several reasons. First, 9 years had elapsed after the 4 appeals had been filed by the parties before the Supreme Court against the judgments of the Allahabad High Court. There was a request to take up this case and dispose of the same, keeping in mind the first litigation started in 1950 when Gopal Singh Visharad filed a suit with regard to a portion of the so-called Rama Janmabhoomi premises. 4 suits were filed, one in 1960, another in 1960, 1950, another in 1960, another in 1961. Then in 1989, 4 suits had been filed. The Allahabad High Court withdrew all the suits from the Court of Civil Judge Faizabad and conducted the trial. 3 bench consisting of 3 honorable judges of the Allahabad High Court conducted this great trial. About 533 exhibits were marked, 87 witnesses traversing about 87 witnesses were deposed before the court, and the total number of pages of the oral evidence recorded ran up to 13,990 pages. About 1,000 books of various languages with regard to the various aspects of the case had been referred to, and the CDs of archaeological department had also been preserved. And ultimately, in October 2010, the 4 suits were disposed of by a common judgment. And the main dispute was with regard to 1,500 square yards in the town of Ayodhya. The dispute was of great significance to both Hindus as well as Muslims. Hindus had asserted that the disputed area is the birthplace of Lord Rama and that a mosque had been illegally built by demolishing a Hindu temple. Whereas Muslims strongly believed and asserted that a mosque had been built by Mughal Emperor Babur on a vacant land, that it was a work for all practical purposes and had been dedicated to God. Let us go, let us try to know about the 4 suits which had been filed. A suit was instituted in 1950 by Sri Gopal Singh Visharad in the Court of Civil Judge at Faizabad, seeking a declaration that he was entitled to offer prayer at the Rama Janmabhoomi temple near the idols. The second suit was filed in 1959 by Nirmohi Akhara, representing a religious sect among Hindus, claiming that they were at all times in charge and management of the structure at the disputed site, which according to Akhara was a temple until 29/12/1949, the day on which an order of attachment was passed under section 145 of CRPC 1898 by the then executive magistrate of Faizabad. Then in 1961, that is on 18/12/1961, Uttar Pradesh Sunni Central Board of Waqfs, a statutory board, and few Muslim residents of Ayodhya chose to institute a civil suit for a declaration seeking absolute title to the mosque on the ground that it had been built on the instructions of Babur on a vacant land and endowed to God at the instance of Babur, and thus it had become a waqf for all practical purposes. In the year 1989, a comprehensive suit was filed on behalf of idol Bhagavan Shri Ram Virajman and the birthplace of Ram by a trust represented by one of its trustees as the next friend. The Justice Devaki Nandan Agarwal, a former judge of the Allahabad High Court, was one of the trustees of the said Ram Nyas, and he chose to represent the idol. The main reliefs sought for were: one, declaration that the entire premises of Sri Rama Janma Bhoomi at Ayodhya, as described and delineated in Annexure 1, 2, and 3, belongs to plaintiff deities, and a perpetual injunction against the defendants prohibiting them from interfering with or raising any objection to or placing any obstruction in the construction of the Rama Janma Bhoomi temple at Ayodhya after demolishing and removing the existing buildings and structures, etc. See, one cannot forget that in the year 1885, a suit had been filed by one Mahanta Ramadas. He wanted to put up a temple in a portion of area measuring 17 into 21, which is called as the outer courtyard in the disputed premises. The suit was dismissed essentially on the ground that if he was granted the prayer sought for by him, it would create a lot of disturbance between the Hindus and Muslims in the locality, and therefore it dismissed. The first appellate court also dismissed the appeal filed by him, but also held that the finding with regard to title and possession was unnecessary, and the second appeal filed before the Judicial Commissioner was also dismissed. Let us keep in mind the dismissal of this suit of 1885, because the question of res judicata will come into picture, and that has been eloquently dealt by the Honorable Supreme Court. Friends, with the 4 suits being agitated before the Allahabad High Court, we have to keep in mind some other important aspects. On 6/12/1992, the disputed structure, Babri Masjid, was demolished by few Karsevaks. Soon after the demolition, in the year 1993, an act was promulgated by the central government called as the Ayodhya Acquisition Act of 1993, acquiring the disputed premises as well as 65 acres of land around the disputed premises. Challenge was made to this act before the Allahabad High Court as also the Honorable Supreme Court by the aggrieved parties. And in the meanwhile, a reference was made by His Excellency the President of India, and the reference sought for was as to whether a temple was built by Babur after demolishing a Hindu structure, and as to whether the structure of mosque stood on a demolished temple. The matter was considered by a constitution bench headed by the then Chief Justice, Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya. It is reported in 1994, 6 SCC 360. Dr. M. Ismail Faruqi and others versus Union of India, connected with Hargyan Singh versus State of UP. Friends, it was a split decision, 3-2. The majority decision held that subsection 3 of section 4 of the above Act of 1993 was unconstitutional, and the remaining provisions of the Act were held to be constitutional. The majority judgment, the majority of the judges held as follows. Subsection 3 of section 4 of Ayodhya Acquisition Act 1993 abates all suits and providing for an alternate dispute resolution mechanism for resolution of the dispute between the parties thereto. This is an extinction of the judicial remedy for resolution of the dispute amounting to negation of rule of law. Subsection 3 of section 4 of the Act is therefore unconstitutional and valid. This is in paragraph 96, and it is further held that the remaining provisions of the Act do not suffer from being invalid. Relates to the abatement of the pending suits before the court and the High Court is severable from the remaining Act, and hence the challenge to the constitutional validity of the remaining Act, except for subsection 3 of section 4, is rejected. Friends, after this judgment, all the suits which were pending before the Allahabad High Court were revived. Let us assume that if subsection 3 of section 4 had been held constitutional valid, this case would not have been taken up by this Honorable Supreme Court. So Honorable Supreme Court, in its wisdom, in the case of Dr. Farooq Ismaili, held that the litigation initiated before the trial courts must find a logical end after recording evidence. This judgment was rendered by the Constitution Bench on 24/10/1994, the day on which Honorable Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya laid down his office on attaining the age of superannuation. This has some relevance. I will definitely deal with the same while discussing about the importance of Ayodhya judgment. First suit was filed in 1950 by Gopal Singh Visharad. The second suit was filed by Nirmohi Akhara. Third suit, it is called as suit number 4 because second suit had been withdrawn. UP's Central Work Board and few Muslim residents of Ayodhya instituted a suit on 18/12/1961 for a declaration of their absolute title to the mosque. And 89, a comprehensive suit was filed. After recording voluminous evidence and hearing arguments, the Allahabad High Court, by a majority 2:1, held that the suits filed by Nirmohi Akhara, that is suit number 2, and suit number 4, suit filed by Sunni Waqf Board, were barred by limitation. In spite of holding that the said suits, 2 suits barred by limitation, relief was equally given to all the parties. One third of the disputed property was ordered to be given to the plaintiffs in suit number 5. 1/3 of the property was ordered to be given in favor of Sunni Waqf Board, in spite of holding that the suit was barred by time. Similarly, 1/3 of the remaining property was ordered to be given in favor of Nirmohi Akara, in spite of holding that the said suit was barred by time. All the aggrieved parties filed 4 separate suits, and they were all clubbed. And as a result of the trial being held by the High Court, an appeal had to be filed under Section 96 of CPC before the Honorable Supreme Court. It was a vested right. The then Chief Justice of India, Sri Justice Ranjan Gogoi, accept the request of the concerned parties to dispose of the matter at the taking into consideration the issues in fact thereof, constituted a constitution bench consisting of 5 honorable judges. Sri Justice Ranjan Gogoi himself headed the bench, followed by present Chief Justice Sri Justice Sharad Arvind Bobde, then Justice Chandrachud, Justice Ashok Bhushan, and Justice Syed Abdul Nazir. It is a classic judgment for yet another reason, because it is an unanimous judgment, no discard. And it is a judgment rendered after hearing arguments for 40 days, marathon argument for 40 days. I am given to understand that the arguments on some days were heard beyond 6:30 p.m. most of the days. The first judgment, an elaborate argument was held in the Keshavananda Bharati case, which we call as basic structure judgment. It was a judgment rendered by a bench, constitution bench consisting of 13 judges. It was a split judgment by majority judgment by 7:6. No, it was arguments were heard for more than 4 months, and ultimately that decision was rendered. In the judicial history of India, few judgments will be remembered for many, many decades to come and many centuries to come. The first judgment that we always remember is the judgment of Golaknath, 1967, in which it is clearly held that the Parliament has no power to amend the Constitution. And the doctrine of prospective overruling was innovated, and it still holds the field. The said judgment, the decision in Golaknath case, to the extent that Parliament has no power to amend the Constitution, was set aside, was held to be unconstitutional in the subsequent judgment of 1973 Keshavananda Bharati case. And similarly, in 1976, the famous ADM Jabalpur's case, Shivakant Shukla versus ADM Jabalpur case, and it was a judgment rendered by a constitution bench with 4:1. The bench unfortunately held that during emergency, the fundamental rights can be suspended. Of course, after the emergency was revoked, a different provision was made in the Constitution itself, and ultimately the subsequent judgments did not concur with the view of ADM Jabalpur case. And we may not get any opportunity to have a constitution bench to decide a civil matter. A civil matter necessarily requires adjudication of rights on the basis of evidence, on the basis of recorded evidence. Trial court has to record the evidence. First appellate court has to consider the appeal. And finally, the second appeal. this case, the Supreme Court has done a human service. All of you know very well that the first appellate court is the final court of facts. This is the only court where evidence can be reassessed and not thereafter. The Honorable Supreme Court, keeping in mind the law laid down by the earlier decisions, has taken a lot of pains to frame appropriate points for consideration. They are found in paragraph 52 of the decision, 52F, points for consideration. As many as 16 points have been considered by the Honorable Supreme Court as the first appellate court in terms of the mandate of Article 41, Rule 31 of CPC. All the points have been eloquently formulated, and they're based upon the important grounds raised in the appeal memos and also important grounds raised during the course of the arguments. I request all of you to read paragraph 52F. It may take a lot of time for me to read all these things. Therefore, I skip to read the points for consideration. Why I'm bringing this paragraph 52F is to bring to your kind notice that appropriate points need to be formulated in a first appeal, lest the first appellate court gets misdirected. There have been umpteen number of judgments of the Supreme Court with regard to the application of this mandate as found under Article 41, Rule 31 of CPC. Then, friends, normally lawyers practicing in the civil courts, trial courts, feel that they are not concerned that provisions of Constitution do not have any relevance to trial courts. Probably this is a myth. Trial court lawyers are also advised to have a small book on Constitution, preferably of PM Bakshi, a small book, very handy book. Just go through one provision after another whenever you find time. You will find as to how they are relevant in day-to-day trial cases. In a case of bail, ultimately the freedom of individual is involved. Freedom of individual is referable to Article 21 of the Constitution of India, which mandates that no person shall be deprived of his life or liberty except according to the procedure established by law. Is it not? If a person who is entitled to get bail in a bailable case and is denied, it is as good as violating the provisions of Article 21 of the Constitution of India. An accused in a criminal case is entitled to have a speedy trial, early trial, because he can't be lured. Whatever may be the decision that may be taken, he may be ultimately convicted. If the court wants to convict the accused, let him be convicted at the earliest. So, speedy trial, providing effective legal aid is a concomitant of Article 14 of the Constitution of India. Friends, why I have focused the importance of some of the provisions of the Constitution, even to a civil case, is that in the present case, Article 25 of the Constitution and Article 142 of the Constitution of India and Articles 269 and 372(1) of the Constitution of India have also been referred to. Friends, in this case, before going to other important aspects, I would like to just read out some observations of the Honorable Supreme Court in this case, in paragraph 77. This court as a secular institution set up under a constitutional regime must steer clear from choosing one among many possible interpretation of theological doctrine and must defer to the safer course of accepting the faith belief of the worshipper. We must firmly reject any attempt to lead the court to interpret religious doctrine and question the faith of the worshippers. Nothing would be as destructive of the values underlying Article 25 of the Constitution of India. Of course, this observation is made with regard to the proposal made for interpreting Hadith, which is a part of Muslim law. This observation is made in the background of the same. But still, this observation holds field with regard to the faith of all worshippers, whether he is a Hindu, he is a Sikh, or a Christian, or a Muslim. That is what is considered by the Honorable Supreme Court while reviewing the Sabarimala decision by a larger bench. Friends, in this Rama Janmabhoomi case, the idols of Ram, idol of Ram and other idols are represented by a guardian, that is a trustee. So what exactly is the legal position of such idols is eloquently considered. Of course, Chief Justice B.K. Mukherjee, former Chief Justice of India, who is an authority on Hindu charitable endowments, has already laid down the law, and the Honorable Supreme Court in Ram Janmabhoomi case has taken pains to reiterate the law laid down by Justice B.K. Mukherjee further eloquently, relying upon his earlier decisions and other decisions of the earlier decisions of the Supreme Court. Paragraph 91 is relevant. I will read it. Quote, God as a juristic person capable of suing and being sued. By the act of conferring legal personality, the corpus is animated in law as embodying a distinct legal person possessing certain rights and duties. Legal personality is not conferred on the supreme being. I will again re-emphasize. Legal personality is not conferred on the supreme being. The supreme being has no physical presence, for it is understood to be omnipotent, the very grand being itself. Divinity in Hindu philosophy is seamless, universal, and infinite. Divinity pervades every aspect of the universe, the attributes of divinity. Friends, I request all of you to read this judgment, study this judgment thoroughly whenever you find time. You may feel that it is a judgment running to 1,000 pages, therefore it is not advisable. Don't have that thing in your mind. Please remove that. It's a wonderful judgment that every civil lawyer should read it invariably. It helps him in the long run either to conduct a civil case or an appeal, as the case may be. This judgment is relevant for certain other reasons. The provisions of Evidence Act, various provisions of the Evidence Act have been dealt with. First is Section 3, evidence. If you read Section 3, it only speaks of the benchmark preponderance of probabilities. In criminal case, we say that the prosecution is expected to prove the guilt of the accused beyond all reasonable doubt. If you closely read Section 3 of Evidence Act, nowhere you find this concept of proof beyond reasonable doubt. We, the Indians, having borrowed the Anglo-Saxon system of law, have borrowed certain other principles followed by the British. Over a period of time, the British courts invented a new dimension called as the proof beyond reasonable doubt. The proof beyond reasonable doubt is nothing but a degree higher than preponderance of probabilities. So, in a civil case, the evidence will be assessed on the touchstone of preponderance of probabilities. whose case is more acceptable than the other. The Supreme Court, the Honorable Supreme Court, has taken a lot of pains to reassess the entire evidence, both oral and documentary, recorded by the trial court, that is the Honorable High Court of Allahabad, in extenso, extensively reassessed, and has held that the case of the Hindus as represented in suit number 5, that is the suit filed in the year 1989 on behalf of Ram Virajman, is more acceptable than the defense taken up by the UP Sunni Waqf Board in that suit, or as plaintiffs in suit number 4, a suit filed on behalf of UP Sunni Waqf Board. Then Section 45 of Evidence Act is also dealt with. Section 45 deals with the term expert. Who is an expert? Expert is one who has a specific academic qualification in a particular subject and an experience. For a doctor who has to come before a trial court and speak about the approximate time of death, the nature of injuries sustained, he must be a person. At least he must have a post-graduation in forensic medicine. He must have conducted many postpartums, and he must have given certain postmortem reports, and he must have given evidence with regard to such reports before the court. In this case, the Allahabad High Court in the year 2002 appointed the Archaeological Survey of India to dig the place where the Babur Masjid was demolished and to give its report, detailed report. It submitted a report by excavation, and the report was considered, and further directions were given to conduct some more excavation and submit a detailed report. In 2003, the report was submitted, and the entire survey work, excavation work was videographed, and all CDs were produced before the court. The Honorable High Court of Allahabad held that the structure was built not on a vacant land, but on a demolished Hindu temple. And the remains of the temple were found beneath this structure. So this was vehemently argued on behalf of UP Sunni Waqf Board before the Honorable Supreme Court. Reassessing the entire evidence, the Honorable Supreme Court has held that the disputed structure of mosque was not built on a vacant place, but on the remains of a temple which was not Islamic in nature. But it has held that it appears there was a gap of 4 centuries. The Babri Masjid was built according to the records somewhere in 1915-28. The Honorable Supreme Court, on reassessing the entire evidence with regard to experts' report, has held that there is nothing on record to show that there existed a temple and that was demolished, and suddenly and soon after the structure of mosque was erected. But it said that the possibility of some non-Islamic structure in vogue about 400 years ago or 350 years ago, and the same having either been removed at that point of time or demolished at that point of time, or it might have fallen on its own. So with this finding, the appellate court, the Honorable Supreme Court, has held that in the light of there being no specific opinion by the experts with regard to the approximate age of the structures found beneath the mosque, it would be very difficult to say. Why I am referring to this section 45 is the evidence of an expert is not a substantive piece of evidence. It is only corroborative in nature. The court may accept it or may not accept it, but when the court inclines not to accept the report of the expert, it is expected to assign valid and cogent reasons to reject the same or to not accept the same. And this is what is exactly done by the Honorable Supreme Court. This, you know, many a case in many a times we say, doctor is an expert in terms of Section 45 of Evidence Act, but there is no presumption to the effect that the evidence of a doctor is a gospel of truth. The evidence of a doctor will have to be assessed as that of any other evidence. 1982, Criminal Law Journal, Supreme Court 1972, Mayur P. Shah versus State of Gujarat. This gives an indication as to how the evidence of an expert will have to be assessed. Of course, with regard to the evidence of experts, the evidence of mint experts, the evidence of chemical examiners, and few others stand on a higher footing. Whereas the evidence of experts like the archaeological experts, the experts, the lower trajectory. 1885 suit, it was dismissed, appeal was dismissed, second appeal was dismissed. It was very on behalf of the UP Sunni Waqf Board that the judgment of dismissal of the suit of 1885 by Mahanta Raghuvar Das, filed by Mahanta Raghuvar Das, acts as res judicata. This is the matter. This aspect of res judicata has been eloquently dealt by the Honorable Supreme Court. What is held is the suit was filed in 1885 only with regard to a portion of the disputed area. That was 17 into 21. The entire disputed area was 1,500 square feet. And all the Ram Bhaktas, all the worshippers of Ram had not been represented by the earlier plaintiff, and it was not a representative suit. These are the two main grounds to reject the plea of res judicata raised by UP Sunni Waqf Board. Then we have the question of limitation. The trial court, that is the Allahabad High Court, held that the suit of the UP Sunni Waqf Board, that which is called as suit number 4, was barred by time. But Supreme Court held Article 142 of the Limitation Act of 1908 was applicable. Because by the time all the suits were filed except the 5th suit, only provisions of Limitation Act of 1908 were applicable, not 1963. So Article 142 provided 12 years time. What happened? On 16/12/1949, the Muslims, according to the evidence, had offered namaz. They were permitted to offer namaz with police protection once in a week, that is on Fridays. This would go to show that there was interruption by the opposite parties for the Muslims to offer namaz on a day-to-day basis. So they were expected to offer namaz on 23rd, the next Friday, by which time, that is on the intervening night of 22nd and 23rd, according to the evidence, some idols were surreptitiously installed in the inner courtyard just beneath the middle dome of the disputed site. As a result of the same, they were not able to offer namaz. In the light of violence that took place between the two sides, the executive magistrate of Faizabad passed an order of attachment under section 145 of the Criminal Procedure Code and handed over the disputed place to a receiver. So 29/12/1949, 18/12/1961, that is before the expiry of 12 years, UP Sunni Waqf Board had filed a suit seeking declaration to the effect that a mosque in its true tenets, in its true tenets of Islam had been built, and they were offering namaz uninterruptedly, and that it was a waqf for all practical purposes being endowed to deity Allah. After analyzing the evidence, Honorable Supreme Court has held that Article 142 of the Constitution of India alone is applicable to the facts of the case. 1908 was not applicable, and therefore it held that the suit was well within time and it was not barred. But it upheld the finding of the trial court insofar as it relates to the suit filed by Gopal Singh Vishar, Nirmohi Akhara, as being barred by time. Then the Sunni Waqf Board and few Muslim residents of Ayodhya, in their plea against the suit filed in the year 1989 on behalf of Ram Virajman, had contended or had averred that they had perfected the title by way of adverse possession. Of course, their plea of adverse possession was in the alternative nature. But the Supreme Court, after reassessing the entire evidence, has come to the conclusion that there was no evidence with regard to Muslims offering namaz after up to 1857. Why? What was the evidence? Statement of the parties and the lawyers were recorded in terms of Order 10 Rule 1 of CPC. Order 10 Rule 1 of CPC mandates the courts dealing with trial suits to record the statement of the parties soon after the completion of pleadings. Of course, now Honorable Supreme Court, now Section 89 of Civil Procedure Code is introduced with effect from 1/7/2002. The provisions of Order 10 Rule 1A to 1C have been eloquently dealt by the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Afcon Infrastructure Case versus Cherian Verghese, 2010, 8th volume, SCC 24. It's a decision rendered by Honorable Mr. Justice Ravindran, who was known for his clarity in thoughts and findings on the points. Though it was a case with regard to the applicability of the consent of both the parties to refer a suit for arbitration, he has considered the scope of Section 89 in its true sense. If one were to read the provisions of Section 89 vis-a-vis the applicable part under Order 10 Rule 1A of CPC, it would appear that it is not incumbent upon the judges or not a mandate to direct the parties to opt for one of the four methods of alternative dispute resolution mechanism. In Section 89, the auxiliary verb may is used. In Order 10 Rule 1 of CPC, 1A of CPC, it is held shall. Fine-tuning the differences, the legislative mistake that has crept in, Honorable Supreme Court has made it clear that all the judges in the trial court dealing with civil suits have to persuade the parties before them to opt for one of the four methods of alternative dispute resolution mechanism. This Order 10 Rule 1A to C has been applied by the Honorable Supreme Court also, though no such attempt was made before the trial court. Honorable Supreme Court, in its wisdom, directed the parties to submit themselves to mediation, and it is in this regard 3 mediators were appointed under the chairmanship of retired Justice Ibrahim Khalifullah of Supreme Court, Ravi Shankar and Sri Ram Panchu. They did their best to mediate between the parties and allow them to generate options to choose. Of course, it was not successful, but Supreme Court did its best to invoke the provisions of Section 89 of CPC, read with Order 10 Rule 1A to CPC in its strict sense. It gave opportunities for the parties to think over. Of course, parties, in spite of best mediation, did not agree. The Honorable Supreme Court ultimately decided the case. Then, what is adverse possession? Whether adverse possession can be pleaded by a plaintiff. Hitherto, it was held that a plaintiff cannot use the weapon of adverse possession as a plaintiff. A party cannot use the weapon as a plaintiff, and that he could only guard it as a defense. If one were to read Article 65 of the Limitation Act 1963, it appears that only a defendant can take up that plea, not the plaintiff. But a 3-judge bench of the Honorable Supreme Court, in the case of Ravinder Kaur versus Manjeet Kaur, 2019, 8th volume, SEC 729, has held that a plaintiff can also seek the relief of adverse possession. What is adverse possession? A person seeking adverse possession must be in possession of the property of another for over a period of 12 years, openly to the knowledge and adversely to the interest of the original owner. Mere possession of somebody's property for a continuous period of 12 years would be insufficient. And such holding of the property by the person who has no title must be made known, must be clear, and to the adverse interest of the original owner. So if one were to take up this plea, extraordinary plea of adverse possession, the burden is always upon him or her to prove such plea in terms of Section 104 of Evidence Act. It is as good, if one were to take up the plea of adverse possession, it is as good as admitting the title of the other opposite party, adversary party, and then proceeding. The Supreme Court has very categorically reassessed the entire evidence, and it has held that it is in a way accepting the right of the Hindus having been offering prayers from times immemorial. And thus, the plea of UP Sunni Waqf Board has been negated. While analyzing the entire evidence, the Honorable Supreme Court has categorically held that despite the setting up of the grill brick wall in 1857, the Hindus never accepted the division of the inner and the outer courtyard. And it is further held in page 43. The evidence indicates that despite the existence of a mosque at the site, Hindu worship at the place believed to be the birthplace of Lord Ram was not restricted. The existence of an Islamic structure at a place considered sacrosanct by the Hindus did not stop them from continuing their worship at the disputed site and within the precincts of the structure prior to the incidents of 1856-1857. The physical structure of an Islamic mosque did not shake the faith and belief of Hindus that Lord Ram was born at the disputed site. learned council fairly stated that the evidence relied upon by the Sunni Waqf Board to establish the offering of namaz by the Muslim residents commenced from around 1856-1857. Though the structure is stated to have been put up in the year 1527 on the instructions of mosque by his commander Baki, there was no evidence to show that the Muslims in that area were offering namaz in the disputed structure ever since the structure was built. To this effect, a statement was made in terms of Order 10 Rule 1 of CPC by learned council representing UP Sunni Waqf Board, Zafar Zilani, and the parties. Therefore, this statement was nothing but an evidence. So the court was concerned only with the period from 1856-1857. What is this 1856-1857? Though there was a lot of dispute between Hindus and Muslims, and while communal violence also took place in Ayodhya. As a result of the same, the then British government ordered a brick grill wall between inner courtyard and outer courtyard. In the outer courtyard, there was already Sita Rasoi, Ram Chabutra. And for this, even to come to this inner courtyard, the Muslims had to come through the main gate in the outer courtyard. Only one main gate was there on the eastern side. And subsequently, another gate was opened on the northern side called as Simhadwar. First was Hanumantadwar and then was the Simhadwar. And this area of outer courtyard was being in the exclusive possession of Hindus offering prayers. It is not as though, according to the evidence, as reassessed by the Honorable Supreme Court, the Muslims were offering namaz uninterruptedly. That is what clearly observed in paragraph 463 of the decision. Friends, Section 145 interim order was passed. Several arguments were advanced with regard to the limitation, provisions of the limitation. Honorable Supreme Court has specifically held that it was only an interim order. The rights of the parties were not decided, though they were called upon to put in their respective stands. So, mere interim passing of an interim order does not commence any limitation. So, Section 145 of CRPC is also very clearly dealt with. The Honorable, before the Honorable Supreme Court, it was further reiterated and contended on behalf of the UP Waqf Board that the structure was a waqf dedicated to God Allah, and there was a recognition by way of dedication. But the Supreme Court held there is nothing on record to show that it had been dedicated as a waqf. Then alternative argument was advanced that it was a waqf by user. Though there were no documents of evidencing dedication to God Allah, the very fact that they had been using for several decades and centuries, they had acquired title by way of waqf. This was negative because the right that the Muslims used to assert was being impinged upon everywhere now and then by the Hindus of Ayodhya and other Ramabhats. And it is specifically held that the suit filed in the year 1989 on behalf of Ram Virajman is a comprehensive suit, and it is not hit by the principles of res judicata. And it is specifically held that an idol can sue and be sued. And therefore, prayer A and B have been ultimately allowed. With regard to the granting of the direction to grant 5 acres of land to UP Sunni Waqf Board, we will have to see the provisions of Article 142 of the Constitution of India. having held that the suit filed by UP Sunni Waqf Board was in time, was within 12 years from the date of alleged dispossession, and having held that idols had been surreptitiously installed on the intervening night of 22nd and 23rd of December 1949, and having demolished the disputed structure of the mosque on 6/12/1992, they had to be suitably compensated, and to this regard, and in this regard, section article 142 of the Constitution of India has been invoked. And friends, this is found in page 405. What does it say? Article 142. The Supreme Court, in the exercise of its jurisdiction, may pass such decree or make such order as is necessary for doing complete justice in any cause or matter pending before it, and any decree so passed or order so made shall be enforceable throughout the territory of India in such manner as may be prescribed by or under any law made by the Parliament, and until provision in that behalf so is made, in such manner as the President may by order prescribe. The relief of the direction given to the central government to grant 5 acres of land, either out of the 65 acres of land acquired under Ayodhya Acquisition Act of 1993, or the direction to the state government to grant 5 acres of land in Ayodhya, Article 142 is the basis. And two important decisions covering the field of Article 142 have been referred to in paragraph 675 of the judgment. Union Carbide Corporation versus Union of India. It was also a judgment with regard to the reliefs to be granted to the Bhopal gas tragedy victims, and articles referring to Article 142, Union Carbide Corporation versus Union of India, 1991, 4 SCC 584. The then Chief Justice Ranganath Mishra has specifically held that prohibitions or limitations, quote, prohibitions or limitations or provisions contained in ordinary laws cannot ipso facto act as prohibitions or limitations on the constitutional powers under the Article 142. But we think that such prohibition should also be shown to be based on some underlying fundamental and general issues of public policy, and not merely incidental to a particular statutory scheme or pattern. And the subsequent decision is of the Supreme Court is in 1998, 4 SCC 409, Supreme Court Bar Association versus Union of India. Justice Anand, speaking on behalf of the bench, has held as follows. Paragraph 47. It, however, needs to be remembered that the powers conferred to the court by Article 142, being curative in nature, be construed as powers which authorize the court to ignore the substantive rights of a litigant while dealing with a case pending before it. Article 142, even with the width of its amplitude, cannot be used to build a new edifice where none existed earlier by ignoring express statutory provisions dealing with the subject. Of course, there was no statutory prohibition for the Honorable Supreme Court to be ignored, and it has considered the various facets of the case to invoke Article 142 of the Constitution of India, and ultimately 5 acres of land is ordered to be given. The last aspect is with regard to the power of the civil court to mold the reliefs. Honorable Allahabad High Court, in spite of holding the suit filed on behalf of Nirmohi Akhara and on behalf of UP Sunni Waqf Board as barred by time, had granted 1/3 share each. The Honorable Supreme Court has held that the case was not for a partition and separate possession. It was a pure case of declaration of title. Having held the plea of limitation in the negative, no such relief could have been granted. And in this regard, in paragraph, in page uh, in paragraph 792, it is held in the case of Ram Kumar versus Mahabir Prasad, which is 1951 SCR 277. Quote, the question, however, arises whether in the absence of any such alternative case in the plaint, it is open to the court to give him relief on that basis. The rule undoubtedly is that the court cannot grant relief to the plaintiff on a case for which there was no foundation in the pleadings and which the other side was not called upon or had an opportunity to meet. Applying the principles eloquently enunciated by Justice B.K. Mukherjee of the Honorable Supreme Court way back in 1951, Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Siddiq LRs, Siddiq Dedbhai LRs has specifically held that the trial court has erred in granting reliefs which did not emanate from any of the pleadings. Friends, Order 7, Rule 7, which speaks about the authority or power of the appellate, the trial court to mold the relief. These aspects have been dealt with. Friends, I have taken a lot of time. There are many things to be looked upon. And one more important point is Articles 1. I have already, with regard to Articles 269 and 372, one of the Constitution of India have also been dealt with, because when the masjid was built by Babur, it was Mughal rule. Then it was annexed by the English. After 1947, we became independent and we have a constitutional rule. What is the effect of these three legal regimes? And with reference to Article 269 and 372, one of the Constitution of India, have also been dealt with in extenso. Friends, I would be through this judgment, my request to all the youngsters is to read this judgment thoroughly. Friends, many of you who are youngsters can take up the examination of a civil judge or district judge. Reading of these judgments really chisels your brain. We may not get this opportunity of a constitution bench dealing with a civil case based on evidence in future. At least in 50, 60 years, we may not have that opportunity. It's a very God-sent opportunity for all lawyers and judges dealing with First Appellate Court. According to me, this is one of the classic judgments, and it has dealt with all aspects of first principles of civil law in extenso. I'm extremely grateful to the organizers, more particularly Mr. Vikas Chatrat, for giving me an opportunity and to share my experience. I express my sincere gratitude to all of you and Mr. Vikas Chatrat. If you have any questions, its time is already over. If you have any questions, you are at liberty to ask.
So one thing, we said that you will be giving insights for 1.5 hours, and spot on it was 1.5 hours. It shows that the precision with which you can speak. It is exactly 1.5 hours spot on. And before we take questions, we have Trivikram, who was the connecting point. I will ask Trivikram to give his insights. Trivikram, Association, Bangalore, Advocates Association.
Mr. Trivikram.
Yeah, he's getting himself unmuted.
Okay.
Trivikram, unmute yourself. Yeah.
Mr. Vikas Chatrat, thank you so much for this pleasant opportunity. And sir, it's a pleasant opportunity, and I will be running short of words to explain or to give my insights. I'm too small as well. I'm in front of such a stalwart and a luminary judge. I'll be running short of words. Of course, just like any other day, it is an erudite and a very insightful session. And sir has dealt in depth, just like his judgment. So for me, I have been so fortunate so far And Sir's expertise is he goes in depth, either in writing a judgment or in his analysis and in his presentation as well. So with that, I am running short of words. I cannot explain anything more. Thank you so much, Mr. Vikas. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Vikram.
So while we were discussing about, we will just have a broader contour since the questions have not come. For youngsters, people would like to understand, I appreciate, though we are already doing separate session on Article 141 read with Article 142 and 226. Powers had been exercised under Article 142 of the Constitution of India. For the participants, could you just explain what would be the 142 powers exercised in this judgment?
See, what the court has taken into consideration the events that happened during the pendency of the suits and also the pendency of suits and various other factors into consideration. It has two important decisions of the earlier decisions of the Supreme Court, one rendered in the case of Bhopal gas victims, that is Union Carbide, and another in the Supreme Court Advocates Association case. It has, according to me, it has rightly come to the conclusion that some injustice was caused to Sunni Waqf Board during the pendency of the case, and this needs to be compensated, and therefore it has passed the decree. It's a part of the decree. And see, while dealing with, at times it so happens whether all the directions given under Article 142 could also be considered under Article 141 of the Constitution of India is a separate subject. Probably it's better you deal with one of the important aspects called as precedents under Article 140 of the Constitution of India. An excellent article by Justice Ravindran reported in 2015, 8th volume, SCC, journal section. Precedents, boon or bane for India. One of the best articles. I think somebody should speak. What's the scope of ratio decedente, obiter dicta? I tell you, this judgment in Afcon Infrastructures case decided by Justice Ravindran with regard to the scope of Section 89. The ratio decidendi was with regard to the applicability of the consent of both the parties for reference of a pending suit to arbitration, notwithstanding an agreement being not found, but other provisions have also been dealt with. Though they are obiter dicta, they are in a way ratio decidendi to be applied in terms of Article 141 of the Constitution of India. I think this Article 141 and 42 require a lot of case, and if the readers were to read this article, 2015, 8th volume, SCC, Precedents, boon or bane by Justice Ravindran. Whenever you find an article or a judgment of Justice Ravindran, never forget it, never miss it, read.
So like you were saying about Justice Ravindran, today morning only we had connected with him since he's recovering from Corona. He has been kind enough to see to our request that he would also be sharing his knowledge.
Oh, it's a great. All of us would be really benefited by his interaction. It's a great
Yes.
Great.
Yes. His judgments were quite insightful.
Insightful. Say Arbitration Act, whatever judgment, whether it is Motor Vehicles Act, Rajkumar versus Jai Kumar, Sarala Verma, can you find judgments? Rajkumar versus Jai Kumar, 2011, 1 SCC 343 is one of the finest judgments about the assessment of medical evidence in injury case. Permanent injury, how does permanent injury affects parameters to be considered by the tribunal while deciding compensation. And Sarala Verma, the thumb rule, and that has been followed by the subsequent constitution decision rendered in Pranay Sethi case by Justice Deepak Mishra, 2017.
They haven't tweeted much except for the fact that 10% should be increased and 70,000 is
of course, in Sati Kaur case, Justice Indu Malhotra has given valid reasons as to how the compensation is to be awarded under the head loss of love and affection for children, for parents, for wife. Also decided now no 45,000 business, 40. For a wife having lost her husband, 40,000. For two children for having lost their father, 40,000. Parents for having lost their son, 40,000. Satinder Kaur case.
Only one question that has come. In case if an application is dismissed with the observation by the trial court, but the observations are contrary to the facts of the case and orders are not challenged, will the observations made be binding or not?
Correct. Even an order passed on an interlocutory application, if it is not challenged, becomes a res judicata. There are some decisions of the Supreme Court itself. Therefore, they have to be challenged. Therefore, suppose you file a petition under Article 227 of the Constitution of India. Ultimately, let us see, even that is also dismissed. But you may request the Honorable High Court to say that, notwithstanding the dismissal of the petition filed under Order 227, nothing comes in the way of the party to urge this as one of the grounds in case the final judgment were to go against him. You seek that relief, reserve that right. Otherwise, it becomes res judicata.
Yes. Since you have given the insights covering the entire depth, and I will request Adi Lakshmi, who also runs a webinar series just like what Trivikram is doing. Adi Lakshmi is from Chennai. I will ask her to share her thoughts. Adi Lakshmi, ma'am. You will have to unmute yourself, Adi Lakshmi, ma'am.
Yes, Vikas, thank you. It was a wonderful session. And
your
thank
video.
you. Okay.
She runs a series for the judicial officers and subordinates.
Okay. You are from Chennai, madam?
Yes, sir.
Good.
I'm practicing here in Madras High Court, sir.
Okay. You go to trial courts also?
A few of the trial matters I go, not much. Most of the High Court works.
You must go to trial courts, madam. You must
Yes.
the thrill of examination, cross-examination, interlocutory applications. It will chisel your brain. Then slowly migrate to High Court, madam.
Sir, I have almost finished 30 years of my bar practice.
Then it's all right. Then it's all right. You have done your duty. Civil law is called as the mother of all laws.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Your art of cross-examination session was very excellent, sir. And you should do one for our Chennai team also, sir, if you find time.
We'll do.
Today's session was really advocates have joined in, sir. And really, we had lot of knowledge sharing being done every day on the webinars. And this particular session was very excellent, sir.
Madam, my intention is to see, unless the community of advocates is strong, judiciary will not be strong. Where do the judges come from? Ultimately, judges come from the lawyers community. So if lawyers are strong, judiciary will be strong. Therefore, we must strengthen the hands of young advocates who should become good advocates, strong advocates, know the first principles very well. Then, if possible, if they are strong, if they become good judges, then judiciary will be strong, and that serves the purpose of our society.
Yes, sir. Definitely, sir. Thank you so much for that. And a lot of the aspirants of judicial services examination had also joined in. Maybe this will give a clue. And many of the landmark judgments are out of the arguments of the lawyers. Yes. The bar is providing the bench with the inputs, and this is the takeaway for us, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yes, a strong bar is a strong bench. Otherwise, converse is always not true.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Congrats, Vikas. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. On behalf of the Legal Eagles Elite team and all the participants from our team, I thank you. And thank you, Lordship, for giving such a wonderful session. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, madam.
So thank you to all the participants who have been watching us live on the Facebook as well as on this platform, and those who will subsequently log into our YouTube channel of Beyond Law CLC. And thank you to Justice A.V. Chandrasekhar. The session was as engaging as the previous session. Rather, to sum up the entire judgment of around 1,000 pages in 1.5 hours is a Herculean task, and the way you just took us across to the entire spectrum and dividing into the various legal aspects only shows that the way one can sum up his entire facts and then put it across even to a bench like we are talking of as the how to lawyer has to work. And tomorrow the session would be on fraud and arbitration. Cumulatus Decade by Ajay J. Nandike, an advocate from Karnataka High Court. Do stay connected with. Thank you, everyone. Stay blessed. Jai Hind. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you, Vikas. Thank you. Very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you, Vikram.